All right, welcome everybody. Good morning. I have 11 o'clock, so we'll get started. We have a lot to cover today. Welcome to the GCOOS sponsored webinar. My name is Chris Simonello. I'm the Outreach and Education Lead for GCOOS, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. We also have Jennifer Vreeland handling the technical aspects of the webinar, so thanks, Jen, for keeping us moving along. For those not familiar with GCOOS, we're one of 11 regions of the U.S. Integrated Ocean Observing System. And our mission is to provide on-demand information about the Gulf's coastal and open ocean waters. So there's 4 main areas where we focus our efforts: marine operations, coastal hazards, healthy ecosystems and living resources, and human health and safety. And we also have 4 cross-cutting themes that straddle these areas, and they're outreach and education, data management and communications, numerical modeling and forecasting, and monitoring long-term environmental change. So let's get to the real reason we're all here today. Today's webinar, we're going to highlight the glider work of the Gulf of Mexico that's supporting hurricane research and forecasting. And the webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the GCOOS YouTube channel. We'll send a reminder after to let everybody know when it's available. You're all in listen-only mode. If you have questions, please enter them in the chat box. If they're really important and relevant to understanding the content, we'll interrupt Kerri during the talk. Otherwise, we'll wait until after her presentation. And so I'm excited to welcome our speaker, Dr. Kerri Whilden. Dr. Whilden is a scientist at Texas A&M University, where she works with the Geochemical and Environmental Research Group, or GERG. And GERG is part of a Gulf-wide effort to collaboratively deploy gliders to monitor ocean conditions that support hurricane research and forecasting. And Dr. Whilden will be sharing with us the recent work of GERG and some of the Gulf partners in recent and planned missions. Her talk, Gulf of Mexico Gliders, Contributions to GCOOS. It's actually very timely because the NOAA Climate Prediction Center recently warned of a potential tropical cyclone in the southern Gulf of Mexico late next week. So all of these data are really critical in helping with these forecasts. So Kerri, I'm going to hand off to you and we'll ask some questions after your presentation. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I do apologize in advance. My throat's a little sore from allergies. It's just like perfect timing. So now I'll be forever memorialized in YouTube now too with my scratchy voice. But I am really excited to share the overview of work that we've been doing with the University of Southern Mississippi and Shell as part of GCOOS. As you mentioned, particularly ahead of the official start of hurricane season, even though we've kind of had an early start with at least 2 named tropical storms already. So as you can tell from the title slide, there are a number of people involved in the data collection, management, distribution, analyzing data, the funding. And I just wanted to take a second to thank them all for their part in this. So with that,
Kerri, we are seeing your presenter mode. I don't know if you want that.
What is that?
We see your presenter mode with your notes and not presentation mode.
How do you do that then?
Are you running 2 screens?
No. Presenter view?
Go to slideshow, yeah, and click presenter view. That might change it.
Did that do anything?
Nope.
Can still see it?
Yeah, slideshow, you have a button that says play. Maybe that's it. I'm not familiar with Mac. Maybe someone else can.
Interesting. Okay. So what if I stop sharing? Share my screen. So my entire screen, maybe? So now do you see do you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that better?
There, yes, perfect.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, so you guys don't get to see all the stuff that I've kind of prepared. Okay, so yeah, title slide and we'll move on. So generally, I mean, when people think of the word hurricane, you think of high winds, storm surge, flooding, property damage, and potentially loss of life. So decision makers really rely on accurate predictions of storm trajectory and intensity to inform the public and assess the risks to coastal regions. Excuse me. So rapid intensification, which is kind of defined as an increase in maximum sustained winds of at least 30 knots in 24 hours, is a challenge for predicting hurricane intensity. Rapid intensification is even more concerning when it occurs prior to landfall, as it leaves people with less time to prepare or adjust for the impact. Now, of course, this doesn't occur for every tropical cyclone, and of these hurricane images, I have Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Maria, and Hurricane Sandy. And for both Maria and Harvey, so Maria in the bottom left and Harvey in the top right are the two that rapidly intensified just prior to landfall. So needing this time to prepare for tropical cyclones extends to the oil and gas industry as well, where decision makers need accurate predictions to decide on when or whether to shut down operations and transport workers back to shore from offshore platforms. For this context, this Google Earth image shows the abundance of platform locations in the Gulf of Mexico. But what it doesn't show is the vast number of refineries and natural gas processing plants located onshore that could also be affected. So as I mentioned, not all tropical cyclones intensify prior to landfall. Most major tropical cyclones do undergo at least one cycle of rapid intensification. So not only is this important in this case for the oil and gas industry in resolving rapid intensification close to shore, but also along the trajectory as some of the platforms are further from shore. So those in the Gulf Coast know that we're no stranger to tropical storms and hurricanes. This is actually particularly evident in NOAA's online historical hurricane tracking tool, which shows historical tracks as far back as 1851. So obviously, as a researcher from Texas A&M, I've focused the plot on Texas, where this particular tool shows 145 storms traversing the state. And honestly, it's a pretty powerful image to see the spaghetti lines heading towards the Texas coast over the last 100 so years. So I've also included the matching storms for each Gulf Coast state: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. So it is important to note that this number doesn't necessarily indicate landfall, and as one storm can traverse multiple states. So this is actually particularly evident with Ivan. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor. Ivan made landfall in the Alabama, Florida Panhandle, Mississippi area, circled around towards the Atlantic, crossed Florida as an extratropical cyclone, made its way back through the Gulf of Mexico, and finally made a second or third landfall on the coast of Texas. So you can also see for Gilbert down here in 1988, made landfall in Mexico, but its trajectory, once it went inward, started going north into Texas. So that's also why it's considered a matching storm. So with this tool, the storms range from extratropical cyclones, tropical depressions, tropical storms, and the categories of hurricanes 1 through 5. With more and more industry and infrastructure along the coast over the last 20 years or so, the Gulf of Mexico has been greatly affected by tropical cyclones in terms of damage. Of the 10 costliest U.S. tropical cyclones, 8 of them made landfall in a Gulf Coast state. And if you remember from the last slide, Ivan, which is on here, actually made multiple crossings of Gulf states. So the data used in this report from NOAA estimated total costs in terms of dollars that would not have been occurred had the tropical cyclone not taken place. So it includes disaster money from federal government, from floods, flood insurance or insurance in general, individual payouts, and agriculture. For this particular table, the costs were adjusted based on the 2020 Consumer Price Index. You'll notice that most, but not all in the top 10 are considered major hurricanes, so a category 3 or greater. So if we look at the full list of US tropical cyclones that resulted in at least $1 billion in damage at the time that they occurred, 29 of the 45 on the list made landfall in the Gulf of Mexico. So to break that down even further, I've included a couple of plots showing their distribution by both category or intensity and decade. The total intensity or category plot shows that most tropical cyclones for this designation were a category 5 or less. And the Gulf of Mexico values kind of show that similar pattern. On the decadal plot, we obviously have one more in the year, so I put 2020 instead of 2019, but just to round out the decade. So we're just starting the 2020 hurricane season, or about to officially start the 2020 hurricane season. But in general, there have been more costly tropical cyclones and hurricanes over the last 3 decades. In particular, the 2001 to 2010 was a particular bad decade for the Gulf of Mexico in terms of occurrences, where Ivan, Katrina, Wilma, Ike all occurred, and that's 4 of the top 10 costliest adjusted for the 2020 cost index that was on the previous slide. So far for this talk, I've really stressed the importance of why hurricane research is necessary, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico. So just a quick recap, each year, Gulf of Mexico communities are at risk for being affected by tropical cyclones, and this is evidenced by the historical tracks and the damage estimates that we just went over. Tropical cyclones entering the Gulf of Mexico are extremely likely to make landfall. I mean, it's a semi-enclosed basin, and there's really nowhere else to go unless there's a de-escalation in the intensity. So accurate prediction of tropical cyclone trajectory, and in particular intensity, to capture the rapid intensification is needed to inform decision makers in the government, industry, and private residents, leading to more time to prepare for the impact. So with all that, how do we fit in as glider operators? So subsurface ocean temperature is actually a really important factor for predicting hurricane activity. It's also used for calculating tropical cyclone heat potential, which quantifies the upper ocean heat content and plays a role in the tropical cyclone formation and intensification. So our particular focus as in the Gulf of Mexico is to, as operators in the Gulf of Mexico, is to focus on regional features. So in the Gulf of Mexico, that would be the Mississippi River plume, the loop current, and associated loop current eddies. So what we want to do is operate autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, to monitor the ocean during hurricane season and collect in situ measurements. So this data from the AUVs, particularly the temperature and salinity profiles, will be assimilated into models to better predict the intensification of these storms. So GERG in particular, or Texas A&M, the Geochemical and Environmental Research Group, has four slocum gliders that can collect data by changing its buoyancy, so it's able to dive and climb in the water column. While deployed, it has iridium communications to transfer data in terms of flight and science in near real time. We approximately transfer data on the order of every 6 to 8 hours, depending. Our standard sensor package is a CTD, a fluorometer, eco triplet with fluorescence for turbidity, CDOM, and chlorophyll. We also have dissolved oxygen sensors, and depending on the glider, that'll either be a Andera Optode or a Rigco. We also have the capacity to run a micro rider, although that so far that hasn't been utilized for this particular mission, but we do have capacity for measuring micro scale turbulence. We also have a number of different pump capacity or capabilities depending on the mission needs, whether it's deep or shallow, and a range of buoyancy allowance with the 800 cc 100 meter pump. So for our four slocum gliders and our two surface vehicles, which actually aren't pictured, we do have a dedicated glider space that's just south of Texas A&M main campus, a couple miles away at the Geochemical Environmental Research Group, where we also have a relatively large saltwater ballasting tank. So while 2019 was our first year for Texas A&M to be directly involved with the hurricane monitoring in the Gulf of Mexico, we actually have operated gliders for 37 other missions for research projects to study hypoxia, loop current eddies, turbulence, the microstructure, environmental quality. So for this particular spaghetti plot of trajectory, only the GERG-based missions are shown. So nothing proprietary that we've done for different customers or ones that we've offered piloting assistance. Though these missions are included in the 38 mission total.
Kerri, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. We've got two questions. One was regarding the CTDs. Are those pumped CTDs?
They are, yes.
Okay, that answers John's question. And then there was another comment to suggest that you hide the sharing dialog box. Otherwise, it's going to be there on the YouTube recording. So if that's possible, if we can do that.
Oh, the thing went away.
Thanks. Thanks for those comments. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Did that go away? Did the sharing go away?
I think you're good, yes.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So GERG mission trajectories. So in terms of GERG mission totals, I mentioned we have piloted 38 missions. Our first mission was in mid-2013. Overall, we've had 864 piloted slocum glider days with data collection. Our longest deployment was I think about 3 years ago, was 105 days on a lithium battery. The average deployment over the 38 missions is about 22 days, and the average deployment over the last 2 years in particular was about 41 days. So our collaborator, the University of Southern Mississippi, has similar capability with the profiling buoyancy gliders. So they have a slocum glider that's a G1, and they also have a sea glider that's on order. Both of them have similar standard sensor packages that the GERG gliders do with CTDs, dissolved oxygen sensors, whether it's a Renko or Andera, and fluorometers, so optics of various wavelengths for backscatter, turbidity, and CDOM. So the University of Southern Mississippi has worked with Shell for the last several years. I think it's 7, if I'm not mistaken, as part of the hurricane monitoring in the Gulf of Mexico. So they've also provided a spaghetti plot for their mission trajectories. So that's shown here. My goodness, squeaky. So with their missions, for the Slocum glider, they had 3 successful missions operating on alkaline batteries. So their average mission length is about 33 days. Their longest mission for one of the G1 gliders is 63 days. And that's due to a alkaline battery swap. So 1 day out of the water, do the swap on the boat, and then put it back in. They've also operated sea gliders on 3 different missions, Shell, NDBC, and for VIMS, offering some piloting assistance. So their average mission length for the sea gliders is actually, their average mission for the sea gliders is 97 days, which is fantastic. So both of us have, really great capability and availability of equipment in order to do the work associated with the hurricane research. So during peak hurricane season last year, both USM and Texas A&M were 2 of 7 gliders deployed in reporting to Gandalf. So those that don't know, Gandalf is the Gulf AUV Network and Data Archiving Long-Term Storage Facility, which is a great acronym. So we were 2 of the 7 gliders as part of the Shell NOAA IUS hurricane glider effort. So it was great seeing all the gliders kind of deployed all at once in this particular region. So the GCOOS and Socorro that are partners that are shown on this plot for GCOOS are part of a larger effort, as I mentioned. So there's also additional gliders that are monitoring for the Caribbean and the Mid-Atlantic and up the eastern coast. So this really is a national effort for this hurricane monitoring. So this was just past peak. I think this was taken September 26th. So kind of near the end of the month. So almost 100 days later, and way past the end of hurricane season, which ends November 30th, both the USM and the TAMU gliders were recovered, and with a very respectable total of 220 compliant glider days. So while the Texas A&M glider was deployed, there were 2 tropical storms in the Gulf of Mexico, Olga, which is shown in green, and Nestor, shown in blue. So our deployment was actually delayed slightly by Imelda, which impacted the Texas coast, and it made landfall as a tropical storm near Freeport, which is, for those not familiar with the Texas coast, is just south of Galveston and is kind of in this area. So while we were actually deployed, Olga was the closest tropical storm to the Texas A&M trajectory. So I have some data to show for some profile data of temperature to show for the duration of when we were out there during the hurricane season. So our profiles are clipped to 300 meters for this particular plot. The profiles actually did go down to 1,000 meters. And I mentioned that we recovered them in January. It's clipped to just the end of hurricane season, which is the November 30th. So in this particular plot, we show the isotherms for the 26-degree and 28-degree Celsius isotherms. So sea surface temperatures above 26 degrees C are typically needed for a hurricane to form, of course, among other factors. A deep warm layer of 26 degrees or higher at 50 meters, about 50 meters or so deep, can also contribute to the formation, but it's not really necessary because due to other conditions, other possible conditions. So at the time of Olga, which is the October 25th to 26th area, for the pink isotherm, which is the 28 degrees C, there is surface cooling as Olga merged with a cold front right around where our glider trajectory was. So there is a change in the isotherm over approximately like 6 hours or so. And that really, that does correspond with the passing of Olga. But what we do see is approximately 2 weeks later, we do see a similar trend for the 26-degree isotherm, but there was no associated tropical cyclone in the area. So for this particular data set, it's likely that these changes were associated with the seasonality and the cold fronts that come through, but additional analysis is still needed to confirm. I think I mentioned before, tropical cyclone heat potential calculation uses the depth of the 26-degree and 28 degrees Celsius isotherms. So it quantifies the upper ocean heat content, which is an assessment for the risk of formation for a tropical cyclone. And you can see, particularly after that November 9th-ish event, that there's really less risk of formation as the surface begins to cool past that 28 degrees C mark. So while the Texas A&M glider was closest to Olga, the USM glider was closest to Nestor. So the USM glider trajectory maintained its north-south transect for the 80 days while it was deployed through the end of the hurricane season. Once hurricane season was over, they shifted to a transect kind of diagonal towards the Stones mooring after the hurricane season for a total of 118 days for the mission. So below you can see the glider trajectory and the trajectory of Nestor as it went past the gliders and onto shore. So I'd like to thank Kevin Martin for supplying this and other aspects of the presentation regarding the USM data. But so here he shows temperature and salinity profiles during the USM deployment. And as you zoom in for temperature and the approximate zoom in for temperature and the approximate timeline for Nestor, there's right now no direct, they're not really seeing any direct effect in temperature and salinity observed. It was a little bit far away, but the analysis is ongoing and particularly looking at the different isotherms. What they do see, however, well, what they do see is the possibility of trapped warm water under the fresh water, which is particularly, you can see in the upper 400, not 400, 40 meters. And this is actually not observed in the models. So like us, there's additional analysis that needs to be done in terms of seeing the direct effects of the tropical storms and the glider data. But we do have to bear in mind that we were kind of on the edge of the storms for each of the cases. So we've talked about the importance of hurricanes and how we collect data, and so now what do we actually do with the data? Where does it go? So as operators, both USM and Texas A&M upload data through GCOOS to the IUS glider deck. And for everyone like me that sees a whole bunch of acronyms and is sometimes hard to remember what all of it is, I've written them out on the side for you. So as I'm riddling off the acronyms, you can still follow along. So as operators, we're uploading our glider data on the order of every 6 to 8 hours or so. And this is data flow through Gandalf and GCOOS and then sent to the IUS glider deck. So this is just a localized national data center for the national glider data. So NDBC does pull data from the glider deck on the order of every hour. So not all gliders are reporting at the same time. So they search for new files on the order of every hour from the IUS glider deck, and then push that data to the GTS, or the Global Telecommunications System. So data from the GTS is then used in the nowcasts and the forecasts for different centers. So like the National Weather Service, for the NAVO, the Naval Oceanographic Office, for NOAA, and all of this ocean observing data is then assimilated either as initial boundary conditions or other inputs into models for hurricane forecasting.
Smash. Oh. 1, 2, 3.
Somebody smashing something. Thank you.
We just check, make sure everybody's on mute there, please. Sorry, Kerri.
That's okay. Okay. So let's see. So we talked about where the data went. So now what are our plans for this coming year? So as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, the official start of hurricane season is next week. So last week, NOAA released the hurricane seasonal prediction, and they are forecasting an above average season. So in their prediction, 13 to 19 named storms, and keeping in mind that we've already had at least 2 named storms with the possibility of another one coming up, I believe. Excuse me. Another thing to consider, I mean, it's still pretty far away, so a lot can change, but I'm showing the sea surface temperature anomaly for the Gulf of Mexico. The temperatures and this is for April of last month, so April 2020. And what you can see is that the temperatures off the coast of Texas and Louisiana are on the order of, 3 degrees Celsius warmer. So while sea surface temperature isn't the only condition necessary for tropical cyclone formation, it is very important once a tropical cyclone has already formed. So peak season is the mid-August to late October. So we are a bit far away, but it could be an important factor later, and it's something to monitor. So plants for this coming season. So it's a little bit of an evolving situation as additional funding is identified. But really the goal is to essentially operate along picket lines for the duration of the peak hurricane season. So our partners with USM and NDBC and Texas A&M, and then 2 additional gliders from NAVO. So we are increasing our coverage along the Gulf of Mexico for our picket lines. So in conclusion, excuse me. In conclusion, the Gulf of Mexico is it's an important region for hurricane studies. The basin's semi-enclosed, there's low elevation along the coast, and that can impact the government, industry, and private sectors. Regional oceanographic features play a role in hurricane intensity, and AUVs are needed to resolve them. I had mentioned that we do have additional gliders. So additional gliders were needed in the Gulf of Mexico to provide more spatial coverage during the hurricane season. To give you an idea of, for context for travel time for along the transect, so one from north to south on both of the Texas A&M and the USM glider, it took about a week to go that far, so for one direction. So that kind of explains why we weren't able to make sudden changes in our trajectory for rapid, for fast-moving storms. So in addition, we do have a long shallow shelf along the coast in the Gulf of Mexico. So tropical cyclone heat potential as an indicator for intensity potential is a little limited in these shallow regions, and along the Texas coast in particular, we saw that for Hurricane Harvey in 2017. So to kind of finish up, both Texas A&M and USM do have the capacity to operate and deploy gliders, and in a variety of locations in the future, and we have the ability to adjust the pumps and the capability and deploy wherever is needed in the future. So with that, I'll end with a picture of the Texas A&M glider recovery off the RV Manta in early January. My email for additional information is kwhilden@tamu.edu. And thanks for having me. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Kerri. Appreciate you persevering through that.
I'm so sorry.
A lesser woman would have declined, so we really appreciate that. I can't wait to post and share the presentation. If anybody's got questions, if you could enter them in the chat box, we'll read them out to Kerri and she can address them. If we don't get to your questions today, we'll be sure and make sure we get replies to everybody by next week. I've got the first question here from Pam. How deep do the AUVs usually transit, and how do you keep them from getting hit by boats or caught by gear?
So it really depends on the specific mission. For the hurricane gliders, our profiles go down to 1,000 meters. But we do have the capability to do profiles inshore using a different pump. In terms of avoiding ships, we do, as a piloting tool, have the approximate locations of the waterways. So when we are operating closer to shore, we do have a general idea of where they are, though not everyone, particularly recreational boaters, stay within those lines. So when we know that we're in a high traffic area or a known established waterway, we do slightly dive. We don't do our inclines as close to the surface in the water column, and we do try to adjust our surfacing so it's not in the middle of a ship channel while we're trying to offload data for 10 minutes.
Thanks. I'm going to read another question from Felix. It says, thank you for the great presentation. He has two questions. One, are the data open source? And two, are you planning to deploy any of the gliders further offshore?
So the data is all publicly available in near real time. So as the glider's coming up, I did mention that you can follow our progress through through Gandalf at GCOOS, and part of the presentation I actually gave the link for that website, and that's on the order of every I don't know, 8 hours or so, let's say, after so the glider surfaces every 8 hours, so that data is relayed and shown in plots and available through the glider deck. So it is publicly available data. The second question was plans to go further offshore.
Yes.
Is that correct? So right now, in terms of our picket lines, there is not a plan for this to go further offshore. Is there a particular is there something in particular that would that you're asking specifically about measuring?
No, I think that was just a general question.
Okay.
You can give him a chance to weigh in if there's a follow-up. Another question, well, one's a comment and one's the question by Philip. Thanks for the great talk. It's great to see how they're being used elsewhere in the world. And the questions are, how does flying in the storms impact the communications of the gliders, as well as impact the recovery of the gliders?
Great question. So with an intense storm, and even sometimes just in general enhanced sea state, there are some problems with relaying that information. So you can actually see in the questions. So in the slide that I have up is the neutrally buoyant Slocum glider at the surface, and that tail section is where the communications are. So there is a little bit of a boost from an air bladder to try to get it a little bit further out, but yes, you're right, there are some communication issues that can result during an increased sea state. So another thing to consider is if there's a lot of rain, or if there's a lot of discharge from the rivers, from the watershed coming out, that can change the density that you're operating in. So if you are closer to shore, you do run the risk, because it is it's a buoyancy glider, of not making it to the surface in order to offload data. In that particular case for Slocums, eventually, if you can't make it to the surface, it will trigger an abort and release an emergency weight. And at that point, it'll be just like a drifter. It'll transmit its position, but it will no longer be able to dive. So in that case, we have to wait for an opening in order to safely recover.
Thanks, Kerri. There's another question here from Adam asking if the biooptical sensors are always on the gliders.
Yes, so we do operate all of our missions, even if it's not required, with the fluorometer data. So actually, we do have some data, optical data from when we were out.
Thanks. The questions in the box are slowing down, so I'm going to take advantage of Kerri's expertise and ask her a question. So with the loop current speeds, do you find challenges? At what speeds can you operate the gliders without them losing their trajectory?
That's a great question. So yes, it can be an issue for operating in the loop current, and it depends on the direction that you want to go. So if you're trying to go against the current, obviously you are going to have some issues for really strong currents. But there are ways operationally that we've gotten around that. So for other missions where we've done some studies in the loop current, we've increased the number of dives so that we can make progress. Increase the number of dives below a certain depth so that we can make more substantial progress. But yeah, there are definitely currents if you're trying to head into them that really aren't conducive to this particular measurement. So either going perpendicular to the current and trying to make some progress that way, or doing maybe a few more dives in order to make some progress, deeper dives, I mean, to make more progress is something that we've definitely done in the past.
Thanks. I am seeing no additional questions in the chat box. We have about 10 to 13 minutes. If there are no additional questions, I think we'll thank Kerri and give her a break on your voice, let you have some recovery time for the weekend.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to thank you again for sharing all the great information. Remind everyone that the recording will be available on the GCOOS YouTube page, and appreciate your time and wish you all a great weekend.